The Carpenter and the Cradle, a History Weaver Adventure, Book 1, by Connie Worden, read by the author. Chapter 32. It was somewhat of a forlorn hope, but Goro crossed to the other side of the river at the best spot for crossing, and walked his dogs for a time in either direction to see if they could pick up any trace of the scent their noses were attuned to find. The others watched him from their side of the river until he was out of sight, but not out of earshot. Suddenly there was the unmistakable sound of excited dogs on the hunt. "Let's go," Limo barked to the men. "They've got something." Porter shrugged and mumbled under his breath, but loud enough that Coe's ears picked up on it. "Probably just a rabbit or a raccoon." But he offered no protest and followed in the wake of the other men. The group splashed across the river at the same spot where Goro had crossed and ran toward the noisy barking. Coe glanced up in the direction of the mountain peak he knew was ahead of them, though it was too close to be seen, besides being hidden by the thick forest wall. If this was the way the pony-tailed stranger had taken, without changing course, he was heading straight up the peak. The morning's pancakes were no match for the fresh air and exercise, Coral decided. They'd had an early start and an early breakfast, and it was well past noon when the little troop descended from Victoria's Peak into the valley between the two peaks. "Well, I'm starving," Coral hinted loudly, hoping the rest of the group felt the same way and would postpone the afternoon's exploration until after some sustenance. "Agreed," April Eagles seconded. "Let's at least try to make it to the spring before we collapse from starvation," Paul suggested. "We can have our lunch by the creek and refill our water bottles. I finished off the last of my water about half an hour ago. I'm too thirsty at the moment to even notice if I'm hungry." "Also agreed," April said wearily, and the little band kept moving. No one had anything left to say. They were all either too hungry, too thirsty, or too tired to make conversation. Each one had carried their own light lunch in individual bags to avoid having to carry the heavy packs which had been left at the campsite. All the food had been stored since the night before, far away from the tents, and in one pack that had been suspended from a branch well off of ground level, just thick enough to support the weight of the pack, but not thick enough to support the weight of a bear. Paul had demonstrated his roping technique by throwing one end of the rope over the branch with the pack tied to the other end. Then the loose end was pulled until the pack was the height of the branch overhead, and the loose end was tied taut to a lower branch. To get at the pack, the knot was untied and the pack lowered to the ground. If the bears figured out how to untie knots, or, more realistically, tug on the accessible part of the rope until the pack was pulled up and over the tall branch and tumbled to the ground, the group could lose their pack and supplies. But they were hoping for bears who weren't smarter than your average bear. It wasn't foolproof or even surefire bear-proof, but it was a risk they had to take with no other bear-proof options available to them. Food had never tasted better to Coral, but the small portion didn't go very far to filling the empty space in her middle. She guzzled as much water as she could hold to try and give herself that full feeling. That may have been a mistake, she realized when it was too late. Bathroom breaks in the raw wilderness surrounded by a group of people were always somewhat of an ordeal, and it was a long walk from the open meadow to the nearest stand of trees or large rocks. Still, she wouldn't have to worry about dehydration. "Goro, hold the dogs here. We'll make better time if we go back for our vehicles and go by river rather than crashing through the underbrush," Limo called to Goro out in front. Coe could hear the telltale signs of his father's heavy breathing, trying to keep up with the dogs and the younger men. Could it be his father was aging after all? Limo would never admit it. But was that his reason for wanting to go back for his vehicle, that he wasn't as fast and nimble as he used to be? The group, other than Goro and his dogs, turned around and headed back to the nearby settlement. Within a short time, they were piling into the sturgeon-nosed bark watercraft tied along the river's bank and paddling off upstream. They'd have to leave the vehicles behind if the man they were following headed away from the river or continued up the mountain. But here where the current was slow and weak, the vessels would be quicker and far less effort. Ko took the paddle his father offered him. Limo would sit in the middle and ride as the head man should, leaving the younger men to do the hard work of fighting the flow with their young man's strength. It occurred to Ko, possibly for the first time, that the reason the young men did the harder share of the work among his people was less about respect for the elders and more about expedience. The thought that his father would grow old someday made him swallow hard 3 times in a row. He couldn't think of his father as an old man. What do you think we could possibly be looking for? Will we know it when we see it, do you think? Coral speculated in an undertone to June as the 2 girls trailed behind the rest of the group, following the stream uphill on the far side of the valley to its source, where Paul Eagles had once followed it before. I don't know. It's a lot of shooting in the dark as far as I can tell, June answered. But what else can we do? We have to try and help Georgie somehow, and this is the only thing anyone's thought of. Yeah, I suppose, Coral panted a little. She wasn't as used to the climbing as the rest of the group. I just can't help wondering if it's all a wild goose chase, though. Very likely, June said nonchalantly. She wasn't too bothered, even if the trip was a wild goose chase. The adventure of it was enough to appeal to her. If only Will would pay a little more attention to her, that in itself would have made the whole trek worth her while. But he was up ahead and apparently engaged in conversation with July. Again. June tried to ignore the sinking feeling that sight gave her. Paul waved back at the others behind him. We found it, he called. The stragglers caught up to the rest and refilled their canteens and bottles from the water as it forced its way out of the ground. Well, what do you think? Paul asked the group. This is Snowy Point. I think this is the spot that was marked on the map from the description the nurse gave me. But I don't know what we're supposed to be finding here. Any ideas? Maylie had the sharpest eyes in her family. She pointed wordlessly up in front of them. The mountain rose steeply at the start of the climb to the Snowdon Peak. A dark indent in the mountain's wall was visible. Is that a cave? July asked, her eyes following Maylie's finger. I'd say so, Paul answered. That's funny. I don't know how I could have missed seeing it last time I was here. Well, look at the big rocks that look like they've slid down from there. They're all in one group or like a line. They look out of place, don't they? The rest is all shale and pebbles. Don't they look like maybe they were blocking the mouth of the cave and they've slid down to expose it? April put in. Or someone slid them down, Paul said grimly. Well, we definitely have to check that out. It's not far, June said, already climbing the unstable pathway made by the shale and pebbles. Careful, June, Paul called after her, but he was climbing after her.